Once, a little Omega with fire in her eyes stood before the Alpha King and declared a promise the whole pack mocked. When I grow up, I will be your mate. They laughed at her weakness. They called it a child's dream, a foolish hope. Even the king himself dismissed it. But destiny has a cruel memory, and 16 years later, when she returned, the promise she made as a girl shook the throne of the most powerful alpha alive. Before we dive in, if this is your first time listening to one of our audiobooks, hit that subscribe button. Your support means the world to us, and it helps us bring you more powerful stories like this one. Stick around until the very end of the video, and if the story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments and share this audiobook to a friend. Now let's begin. Chapter 1. The Child's Bold Promise. The night air crackled with magic and danger as 7-year-old Lyra pressed herself against the cold stone pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. She shouldn't be here. Omega pups weren't allowed at the Harvest Moon Festival, especially not the broken ones like her, with their weak scent and trembling hands. But tonight, something fierce burned in her chest. Something that made her sneak past the guards and slip into the grand courtyard where the most powerful wolves in the kingdom gathered under the blood-red moon. Alpha King Kieran Blackthorn sat on his obsidian throne like a god carved from shadow and starlight. Even from across the vast courtyard, his presence hit her like a physical force, raw power that made every wolf in the kingdom bow their head in submission. His dark hair caught the moonlight, and those piercing silver eyes seemed to see straight through souls. Lyra had dreamed of him every night since she could remember. Not the gentle dreams little girls were supposed to have, but something deeper, something that made her wolf whimper and yearn even though she was still too young to understand why. The crowd erupted in laughter as Lord Aldrich, the king's beta, finished telling some joke about weak bloodlines. The sound cut through Lyra like broken glass, and before she could stop herself, her small voice rang out across the courtyard. I'm going to marry you when I grow up. The laughter died instantly. 1,000 pairs of eyes turned toward the small figure in a torn dress, standing alone in the sea of silk gowns and midnight suits. The silence stretched so tight it could snap. What did you say, little one? The Alpha King's voice was velvet over steel, carrying easily across the courtyard without him raising his tone. Lyra's cheeks burned, but she lifted her chin higher. Her wolf might be weak, but her spirit wasn't broken. Not yet. I said I'm going to marry you. Her voice shook, but she held a stare. When I grow up. The courtyard exploded. The audacity. A worthless Omega. Someone get that child out of here. But King Kieran raised one hand, and the crowd fell silent again. He rose from his throne, all 6 feet 4 inches of lethal grace, and began walking toward her. Each step echoed like thunder. Lyra's instinct screamed at her to run, to submit, to crawl away and hide. But she stayed frozen, caught in the trap of his silver gaze. He stopped just 3 feet away, close enough that she could smell his scent, pine and winter storms, and something wild that made her 7-year-old heart race. You think you're worthy of a king, little wolf? His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something dangerous underneath. No, Lyra whispered, honest to her core. But I will be. A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Even Lord Aldrich stepped forward, his face pale. Your Majesty, the child doesn't understand. Silence. The king never took his eyes off Lyra. He crouched down until they were eye level, and she could see gold flecks in those silver depths. What's your name? Lyra. Lyra Ashford. His eyes flickered with something. Surprise? Recognition? But his expression remained unreadable. Tell me, Lyra Ashford, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the courtyard, what makes you think a broken little Omega could ever stand beside the most powerful alpha in the realm? The words should have crushed her. They were meant to. But instead, they lit a fire in her chest that burned brighter than her fear. Because she said, her small hands clenching into fists, broken things can be made stronger than they were before. For a long moment, the king studied her face. Then, impossibly, the corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile. 16 years, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. If you still believe those words when you return to my court as a woman, then we'll see just how strong you've become. The crowd began murmuring again, but Lyra barely heard them. Her whole world had narrowed to the king's face, to the promise, or was it a threat, in his silver eyes. Heat flooded her cheeks as the weight of what she'd done crashed over her. She'd just declared her intention to marry the most feared man in the kingdom. In front of everyone. I have to go, she whispered. Yes, he agreed quietly, you do. Lyra turned and ran, her bare feet silent on the stone as she darted between the legs of shocked nobles and out of the courtyard. Behind her, she could hear the buzz of 100 conversations starting at once, but she didn't look back. She couldn't see the way the Alpha King remained crouched where she'd left him, staring at the spot where she'd disappeared with an expression no one could read. She couldn't see how his fingers flexed against his thighs, fighting the strangest urge to follow her. She couldn't see the way Lord Aldrich approached him, voice low with concern. Your Majesty, surely you don't intend to honor the foolish words of a child. 16 years, Aldrich, the king said softly, finally rising to his full height. His silver eyes remained fixed on the shadows where she'd vanished. We'll see what 16 years can do. And in the darkness between the stone pillars, something shifted. Something that had been watching, waiting, planning. The little Omega had just painted a target on her back. But she'd also done something far more dangerous. She'd made the Alpha King remember what it felt like to be surprised. Chapter 2. The Return. 16 years later, Lyra Ashford stood at the iron gates of the Blackthorn Kingdom, and this time, she wasn't running away. The guards who remembered a scrawny 7-year-old pup couldn't hide their shock as they stared at the woman before them. Gone was the fragile child in a torn dress. In her place stood someone who commanded attention without saying a word, tall, elegant, with curves that could stop traffic and eyes that held secrets darker than midnight. Her midnight black hair fell in waves down her back, and she wore a fitted burgundy dress that hugged every line of her body like armor made of silk. But it was her scent that truly made them step back, no longer the weak, barely their whisper of a broken Omega. Now she smelled like wildfire and winter storms, dangerous and intoxicating. Lady Ashford, the head guard stammered, clearly remembering protocol at the last second. We weren't expecting you. I'm sure you weren't. Her voice was velvet with an edge of steel. Nothing like the trembling whisper from years ago. But I'm here on official business. The Ashford lands require representation at court. It was true, technically. Her father's death 3 months ago had left their small territory without a voice in the king's council. But that wasn't why she was really here. She was here because someone had murdered her father and made it look like an accident. Someone connected to this court, to this kingdom. And she would find them, even if it meant walking back into the lion's den. Even if it meant facing him again. The massive oak doors to the great hall groaned open, and Lyra stepped into a room she hadn't seen since she was a child. It looked exactly the same, soaring stone arches, stained glass windows that painted rainbow patterns on the floor, and that obsidian throne that seemed to drink in light. The court was in session. Dozens of nobles turned to look at the newcomer, their conversations dying as recognition slowly dawned on face after face. Is that? It can't be. The little Omega who? Impossible. Lady Cordelia Ravencrest, who had laughed the loudest that night 16 years ago, nearly dropped her wine glass. Lyra Ashford, she breathed, her face pale. We thought you were dead. Disappointed. Lyra's smile was sharp as a blade. But she wasn't looking at Cordelia. Her eyes were searching the front of the hall, moving inevitably toward the throne where, there he was. Time seemed to stop as their gazes collided across the vast room. Alpha King Kieran Blackthorn sat exactly as she remembered, but 16 years had transformed him from merely dangerous to absolutely devastating. His dark hair was longer now, swept back from a face that had grown harder, more angular. His shoulders were broader, his presence even more commanding if that was possible. But those silver eyes, they were exactly the same. Sharp as winter ice and twice as cutting. He was staring at her with an intensity that made her skin burn, and she knew that he remembered every word from that night. The promise, the challenge, the way he'd looked at her like she was a puzzle he couldn't solve. The entire court held its breath, waiting. Lord Aldrich, grayer now but still at the king's right hand, leaned forward. Your Majesty, perhaps we should. No. The king's voice cut through the silence like a sword. He stood slowly, gracefully, his eyes never leaving Lyra's face. Even from across the room, she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical touch. The silence stretched so tight it could shatter. Then, impossibly, the corner of his mouth curved up in something that wasn't quite a smile, but was far more dangerous. So, he said, his voice carrying easily to every corner of the great hall, rich with dark amusement and something else she couldn't name, the little Omega kept her word after all. Chapter 3. Trials of the Heart. The whispers started before Lyra had even been shown to her chambers. They followed her through the corridors like poisonous smoke, cruel, cutting words meant to slice at her confidence and remind her of her place. Did you see the way she looked at him? Shameless. 16 years away and she still thinks she can claim a king. Someone should remind her what happened to the last Omega, who reached too high. Lyra kept her spine straight and her expression neutral. But each word was a small blade finding its mark. She'd grown stronger, yes, but some wounds never fully healed. In her assigned room, notably in the East Wing, far from the royal quarters, she found Lady Cordelia waiting with 2 other she-wolves from prominent families. Welcome home, dear, Cordelia purred, her smile sharp as glass. I do hope you remember how things work here. The king may indulge childhood fantasies for amusement, but reality has a way of correcting such delusions. Before Lyra could respond, a knock echoed through the room. All 4 women turned as the door opened to reveal a figure that made Lyra's breath catch. Alpha King Kieran filled the doorway, his presence instantly changing the energy in the room. The other women immediately bowed their heads in submission, but Lyra held his gaze. Ladies, his voice was polite but dismissive. I need a word with Lady Ashford. Alone. They scattered like leaves in a storm, but not before Cordelia shot Lyra a look that promised retribution. When the door closed, the silence stretched between them like a live wire. Testing my resolve already? Lyra asked, proud that her voice stayed steady despite her racing heart. He stepped further into the room, and she was reminded of how he moved, like a predator who knew he was the apex of his food chain. Your father's death, he said without preamble. It wasn't an accident. The words hit her like a physical blow. You know. I suspected. Now I'm certain. His silver eyes studied her face. Someone wanted you to return to court. The question is why? And you think I'm bait. It wasn't a question. I think, he said, moving closer, that you're either very brave or very stupid. And I've never known you to be stupid, Lyra. The way he said her name, soft and rough at the same time, made something flutter low in her stomach. So what do you suggest, Your Majesty? His smile was sharp. I suggest we give them what they're expecting. Let them think you're here chasing childhood dreams while we find your father's killer. And how exactly do we do that? By making them believe I'm considering your proposal. Heat flooded her cheeks, but she lifted her chin. I never made a proposal. I made a statement. Did you? He was close enough now that she could smell his scent. Still pine and winter storms, but richer, somehow more intoxicating. Then tell me, Lyra Ashford, do you still intend to marry me? The question hung between them like a challenge. She could feel the weight of it, the danger in answering either way. That depends, she whispered, on whether you're worthy of me. Something flashed in his eyes, surprise, heat, approval. Before she could process it, he was moving, backing her against the wall with predatory grace. His hands came up to brace on either side of her head, caging her in. Careful, little wolf, he murmured, his voice rough. You're playing with fire. I've been burned before, she breathed, tilting her head back to meet his gaze. I'm not afraid of the heat. For a moment, she thought he might kiss her. The air between them crackled with tension, so thick she could barely breathe. But then he pulled back, leaving her cold and aching. The moon festival is in 3 days, he said, his tone carefully neutral again. You'll attend as my guest. It wasn't a request. The night of the moon festival arrived with all the pomp and ceremony Lyra remembered from childhood. The great hall had been transformed with silver decorations and moonflowers, their ethereal glow casting everything in soft, romantic light. Lyra wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that hugged her curves before flowing out in elegant waves. She'd chosen it specifically because it made her eyes look like starlight and her skin glow like moonbeams. But as she entered the hall, she realized all her careful preparation meant nothing in the face of the pack's cruelty. The whispers started immediately, louder and more vicious than before. Look at her, dressed like a queen. Someone should tell her pretending won't make it real. The king's just playing with her. Everyone knows he'll choose Lady Serena Blackwood when he's ready to mate. At the mention of Serena, the stunning alpha female from the most powerful family after the royal line, Lyra felt her confidence waver. Serena stood near the throne in a gown of pure white, her blonde hair gleaming like spun gold, every inch the perfect queen. Having second thoughts? The voice belonged to Lord Marcus Grimm, one of the king's counselors. His smile was cold as he moved to block her path. Perhaps it's time you accepted reality, Lady Ashford. Omega blood will never be royal blood. The bloodline must remain pure, another voice added. Lady Vivian Cross, the king's aunt, approached with several other council members. Surely even you can understand that. Lyra felt the familiar burn of shame rising in her chest, the same feeling that had driven her to run 16 years ago. Around them, conversations were stopping as more and more wolves turned to watch the confrontation. The king needs an heir, Lord Marcus continued, his voice carrying to the growing crowd. Strong pups, pure bloodlines, not the weak offspring of a broken Omega. The words hit like physical blows. Lyra's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her wolf snarling in rage and pain. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to fight back, but that's enough. The voice cut through the hall like a blade of pure ice. Every conversation died instantly as Alpha King Kieran strode through the crowd, his presence parting the sea of nobles like Moses parting the Red Sea. His silver eyes were blazing with fury, and his scent, his scent was terrifying. Pure dominance and barely leashed violence that made every wolf in the hall bare their necks in submission. Everyone except Lyra. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that their arms almost touched, and turned to face the council members who had been tormenting her. Did I hear correctly? His voice was deadly quiet. Did you just question my judgment? Lord Marcus paled. Your Majesty, we were merely suggesting. You were insulting my guest. The king's eyes swept the crowd, landing on each face that had joined in the mockery. In my hall, during my festival, the silence was so complete you could hear a pin drop. Then, in a move that sent shockwaves through every person present, the Alpha King reached out and took Lyra's hand in his. The contact sent electricity shooting up her arm, and she saw his jaw clench slightly as if he felt it too. Lady Lyra Ashford, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the great hall, is under my personal protection. Anyone who insults her insults me. Anyone who questions her worth questions mine. The court erupted in gasps and whispers, but he wasn't finished. And if I hear one more word, one single word, about bloodlines or worthiness or what she can or cannot be, his voice dropped to a growl that made every wolf in the room tremble, I will consider it an act of treason against your king. The threat hung in the air like a sword over their heads. No one moved. No one even seemed to breathe. Then the king turned to Lyra, and his expression softened just slightly, just enough to make her heart stop. Would you honor me with a dance, Lady Ashford? The question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Every eye in the hall was fixed on them, waiting for her answer. Lyra looked up into those silver depths and saw something that made her breath catch. Not just protection or political maneuvering, but something raw and honest that he was letting her see. The honor would be mine, Your Majesty. He led her to the center of the dance floor, and the crowd parted like water. As the musician struck up a slow, haunting melody, he pulled her into his arms with movements that spoke of barely restrained power. They moved together like they'd been dancing for years, her body responding to his lead with an instinct that went deeper than thought. His hand at her waist burned through the silk of her gown, and every time he spun her, she felt dizzy with more than just the motion. You realize, he murmured close to her ear, there's no going back after tonight. I never wanted to go back, she whispered, then flushed at her own boldness. His grip on her tightened, almost imperceptibly. Lyra. But the dance ended, and with it, the spell was broken. He escorted her from the floor with perfect propriety, but she could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation that would follow her for days. What she didn't expect was the soft knock on her chamber door an hour later. Chapter 4. Fulfillment of the Promise. Lyra opened the door to find the Alpha King standing in her doorway, no longer the composed ruler from the dance floor. His formal jacket was gone, his shirt partially unbuttoned, and his dark hair was disheveled as if he'd been running his hands through it. We need to talk, he said simply. She stepped aside to let him in, hyper-aware of how intimate this was. Him in her private chambers, both of them alone with nothing but moonlight and honesty between them. He moved to the window, staring out at the silver landscape, his shoulders tense with some internal battle. 16 years ago, he said quietly, a little girl made me a promise. Lyra's heart stuttered. Kieran, do you remember? He turned to face her, and the vulnerability in his expression took her breath away. Do you remember what you said? Heat flooded her cheeks, but she held his gaze. I said I would marry you when I grew up. The words came out barely above a whisper. I was 7 years old and completely out of my mind with whatever 7-year-olds feel when they think they're in love. Something flickered across his face. And now, she laughed shakily. Now I know the difference between a childhood crush and... She trailed off, unable to finish. And what? He stepped closer, his voice rough. And something that could destroy me, she whispered. He was moving toward her now with that predatory grace that made her pulse race. I never forgot, he said, his voice low and intense. Not your words, not your courage, not the way you looked at me like I was worth something more than fear. Everyone fears you. Everyone accepts you. He was close enough to touch now, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his silver eyes. Even as a child, you saw something in me that no one else did. What did I see? Her voice was barely a breath. A man, he said simply, instead of a monster. The words broke something inside her chest. Before she could think, before she could stop herself, she reached up and cupped his face with her palm. You're not a monster, Kieran. He closed his eyes and leaned into her touch like a man starving for gentleness. You don't know the things I've done. The blood on my hands. I don't care. His eyes snapped open, blazing with something that made her knees weak. You should, but I don't. She stepped closer, close enough that their bodies were almost touching. I never have. For a moment, they stood frozen on the knife's edge between safety and disaster. Then he was kissing her, his mouth claiming hers with a hunger that spoke of 16 years of waiting, of wanting, of denying himself something he'd craved since the moment a brave little girl had looked him in the eye and promised to be his. When they broke apart, both were breathing hard. Lyra, he said, his forehead resting against hers, we can't. Why? The word came out fierce, demanding. Because when I claim you, his voice was rough with need, it won't be in secret. It won't be hidden or shameful or something to be denied. When I make you mine, the whole world will know. Her heart stopped. When you claim me, he pulled back to look at her, his expression intense and possessive and completely certain. Did you think this was just about childhood promises? Did you think what I feel for you is some indulgence of nostalgia? She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. You're my mate, Lyra, he said, the words dropping between them like stones into still water. My fated mate. My wolf has known it since you were 7 years old, and I've been fighting it ever since. Fighting it? Why? Because you were a child. Because you deserve the chance to grow up, to choose your own path, to become the woman you were meant to be without the weight of my claim on your shoulders. Tears burned behind her eyes. And now, he said, his thumb tracing her cheek, you're exactly who I always knew you'd become. Strong, brave, beautiful, mine. The last word came out like a growl, and she felt it in every cell of her body. Tomorrow, he continued, there's a full pack gathering. The quarterly meeting where all the major families come to renew their oaths of loyalty. Her stomach dropped. Kieran, I'm going to claim you in front of everyone, he said, his silver eyes holding hers captive. I'm going to tell them you're their Luna Queen, and then I'm going to dare any one of them to challenge it. The Great Hall had never held so many wolves at once. Every major family in the kingdom was represented, along with their retainers, their allies, their enemies. The air thrummed with power and barely contained aggression. Lyra stood with the other noble ladies, trying to blend in, but she could feel eyes on her from every direction. The whispers had gotten worse overnight. Someone had seen the king leaving her chambers, and now speculation ran rampant. The quarterly oath renewal will now begin, Lord Aldrich announced from beside the throne. One by one, the great families came forward to renew their vows of loyalty to the crown. It was a tradition as old as the kingdom itself, a ceremony that reinforced the bonds holding their society together. Lyra watched it all with growing dread, knowing that in minutes, everything would change. When the last family had sworn their oath, the king rose from his throne. Before we conclude, his voice carried to every corner of the vast hall. I have an announcement that concerns the future of this kingdom. The silence was immediate and complete. For too long, he continued, I have ruled without a queen by my side. Today, that changes. Gasps echoed through the hall. Every unmated female held their breath. The king's eyes found Lyra's across the crowded room, and she saw love and determination and absolute certainty in those silver depths. Lady Lyra Ashford, he said, his voice ringing with authority, approached the throne. Her legs felt like water, but somehow she managed to walk through the parting crowd. Every step felt like it took forever. Every face she passed showed shock, outrage, or calculating interest. When she reached the base of the throne platform, he descended to meet her, taking her hands in his. 16 years ago, he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. This woman made me a promise. She told me she would marry me when she grew up. The crowd murmured, remembering. Today, I make her a promise in return. He dropped to one knee before her, and the hall erupted in gasps. Lyra Ashford, you are my fated mate, chosen not by politics or bloodlines, but by the moon goddess herself. You are my equal, my partner, my Luna Queen. Tears streamed down her face as he continued. I claim you before this pack, before the moon goddess, before every wolf in this kingdom. You are mine, and I am yours for all the days of our lives. The ritual words of a claiming bond. Binding. Unbreakable. Eternal. Do you accept? He asked, though they both knew her answer. I accept, she whispered, then louder, I accept. He rose and kissed her, sealing the bond before hundreds of witnesses. The hall exploded. Cheers from some. Cries of outrage from others, the sound of chairs scraping as wolves leaped to their feet in shock or celebration. Through it all, Lyra heard only the sound of her own heartbeat and the whispered words Kieran spoke against her lips, finally. But in the crowd, hidden among the celebration and chaos, shadowed faces exchanged dark looks. Hands moved to weapons. Plans that had been 16 years in the making shifted and adapted. The little Omega had just become the most powerful woman in the kingdom. She had also just signed her own death warrant. And somewhere in the crowd, Her father's killer smiled. Chapter 5. Shadows Against the Crown. 3 weeks into her reign as Luna Queen, Lyra discovered that wearing a crown made you a target for every blade in the kingdom. The attempt started small, subtle sabotage that could be dismissed as accidents. Her horse spooked during a morning ride, nearly throwing her into a ravine. A chandelier crashed down moments after she'd walked beneath it. Her personal maid quit without notice, claiming family illness, only to disappear entirely from the kingdom. But it was the letter slipped under her door that made her blood run cold. Queens can fall as easily as children. Some promises should never be kept. Show me. Kieran's voice was deadly quiet as he read the note for the third time. They were in his private study, the fire crackling in the hearth doing nothing to warm the ice in his silver eyes. It's not signed, Lyra said, trying to keep her voice steady. It could be anyone. It's not anyone. He stood and moved to the window, his shoulders rigid with tension. It's someone who knows about your childhood promise. Someone who was there that night 16 years ago. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Someone in the court. Someone close enough to get into the royal wing without being questioned. Close enough to know your routines, your habits. His hands clenched into fists against the windowsill. Close enough to put poison in your food, or a blade in your back. Fear crawled up her spine, but she forced herself to think clearly. What do we do? He turned back to her, and the raw emotion in his expression made her breath catch. For just a moment, the mask of the Alpha King slipped, and she saw the man beneath, terrified and trying desperately to hide it. I've survived countless battles, he said quietly. I've faced down armies, challenged alphas twice my size, stared death in the face more times than I can count. But the thought of losing you... His voice cracked slightly. That's the one thing that breaks me. She went to him then, wrapping her arms around his waist and pressing her face against his chest. His heartbeat was racing beneath her ear. You won't lose me, she whispered fiercely. I didn't fight this hard to be with you just to let some coward with a poison pen scare me away. His arms came around her, crushing her against him. Promise me, he said roughly. Promise me you won't take any unnecessary risks. No riding alone. No walking the gardens without guards. No eating or drinking anything that hasn't been tested first. Kieran, promise me, Lyra. His voice was raw with desperation. I can protect you from armies, but I can't protect you from shadows. She pulled back to look at his face, seeing the fear he was trying so hard to hide. I promise. But even as she said the words, she knew that in a court full of enemies, promises were just another kind of weapon. The grand feast celebrating the kingdom's founding was meant to be a show of unity and strength. Every noble family in the realm had gathered in the great hall, which had been transformed with golden banners and crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across the stone walls. Lyra wore a gown of midnight blue silk that hugged her curves before flowing out in an elegant train. The Luna Queen's crown, a delicate circlet of silver and moonstones, rested on her dark hair like captured starlight. She looked every inch the queen she'd become. But beneath the surface, tension crackled like lightning. She could feel the stares, the whispered conversations that stopped when she passed. Lady Cordelia watched her with barely concealed hatred. Lord Marcus's smile was cold as winter frost. Even some of the guards seemed to avoid her eyes. You're being paranoid, she told herself, but the feeling of being watched, hunted, never left her. Kieran kept her close throughout the evening, his hand at her back a constant reminder of his protection. But even he couldn't be everywhere at once, couldn't watch every face in the crowd or test every glass of wine. My queen, Lady Serena Blackwood appeared at her elbow with a crystal goblet filled with deep red wine. You look pale. Perhaps some refreshment. Lyra hesitated. The wine smelled perfect, rich and sweet with hints of blackberry. But something in Serena's eyes, a glitter of satisfaction, made her stomach clench with unease. Thank you, she said carefully, accepting the glass but not drinking. It's from my family's vineyard, Serena continued, her smile sharp. A special vintage we've been saving for special occasions. Before Lyra could respond, Lord Aldrich's voice boomed across the hall. A toast to our Luna Queen, who has brought new strength to our ancient bloodline. The crowd raised their glasses, and etiquette demanded she drink. Hundreds of eyes watched her expectantly. Kieran appeared at her side, his own goblet in hand, but his eyes were on her face. Lyra. She looked down at the wine, then at Serena's expectant expression, then at the crowd of nobles who had never wanted her as their queen. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. Trust your instincts, little wolf. They'll keep you alive when everything else fails. But she was Luna Queen now. She couldn't appear weak or paranoid in front of the entire court. She raised the goblet to her lips. The wine was perfect, smooth and rich with just a hint of sweetness. She drank deeply, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. Excellent choice, she told Serena, who smiled with what looked like genuine pleasure. The feast continued around them, courses of roasted meats and exotic fruits, entertainment from traveling musicians and acrobats. Lyra began to relax, thinking perhaps she'd been imagining threats where none existed. It was during the third course that the first wave of dizziness hit her. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself as the room seemed to tilt sideways. Her vision blurred, and she could taste something bitter at the back of her throat. Lyra. Kieran's voice seemed to come from very far away. What's wrong? She tried to answer, but her tongue felt thick and clumsy. The faces around her were spinning, blending together in a kaleidoscope of concern and satisfaction. She managed. Then the second wave hit her like a sledgehammer. Her legs gave out completely. She pitched forward, dimly aware of Kieran catching her before she hit the floor. The hall erupted in screams and shouts, but the sound seemed muffled, like she was hearing them underwater. Poison, she heard someone shout. The queen's been poisoned. Through her fading vision, she saw Kieran's face above her, his expression twisted with fury and terror. His lips were moving, but she couldn't make out the words. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was a figure in the crowd, someone watching with cold satisfaction as the Luna Queen collapsed. Someone who had been waiting 16 years for this moment. Someone who finally had their revenge. Chapter 6, Legacy of Love. Lyra woke to the sound of screaming. Not her own. She was alive, breathing, her heart beating steadily in her chest despite the lingering taste of poison on her tongue. The screaming came from somewhere else in the castle, raw and filled with terror. Kieran, she whispered, trying to sit up in the familiar surroundings of their private chambers. Easy. Gentle hands pressed her back down. Dr. Thorne, the royal physician, leaned over her with worried eyes. The antidote worked, but you need rest. You were unconscious for 2 days. 2 days. Fear shot through her. Where is the king? Dr. Thorne's expression darkened. Hunting. The screaming came again, closer this time, and Lyra recognized the voice, Lord Marcus Grimm, the counselor who had questioned her worthiness at the Moon Festival. What has he done? She breathed. What any mate would do, Dr. Thorne said quietly. He's tearing the kingdom apart to find who tried to kill you. Through the window, she could see smoke rising from the courtyard. The acrid smell of burning parchment drifted through the air. Someone was destroying evidence, or Kieran was burning down anyone who stood in his way. How many? She asked. 7 families under investigation. 12 nobles in the dungeons. And that's just the beginning. Dr. Thorne's voice was grim. He's had every servant, guard, and kitchen worker questioned. Anyone who had access to you that night has been arrested. Another scream echoed through the halls, cut off abruptly. I have to stop him, Lyra said, struggling to sit up despite the doctor's protests. He's going to destroy everything we've built. My lady, you're still weak. I'm alive, she said firmly, swinging her legs over the edge of the bed. And that's all that matters. She dressed quickly in a simple gown of deep green, not bothering with the crown or royal regalia. This wasn't about being a queen. This was about being a mate to a man who was losing himself to rage and fear. The Great Hall had been transformed into something out of a nightmare. Kieran sat on his throne like an avenging angel, his silver eyes blazing with fury. His clothes were torn and bloody, his knuckles split from what she could only imagine. Lord Marcus knelt before him, his face a mess of bruises and blood. "Please," Marcus begged. "I swear on my family's honor, I had nothing to do with." "Your family's honor?" Kieran's voice was soft, deadly. "The same honor that let you mock my maid in front of the entire court? That was different. That was—" Kieran was out of his throne and across the floor in a heartbeat, grabbing Marcus by the throat and lifting him clear off the ground. "My mate nearly died," he snarled, and Lyra could see his wolf in his eyes, feral and barely contained. "Someone in this room, someone I trusted, tried to murder the woman I love, and I will burn this entire kingdom to the ground before I let them succeed." "Kieran." Her voice cut through the chaos like a blade of silver light. Every head turned toward her, and she saw the shock in their faces. They'd thought she was dead. But it was Kieran's reaction that broke her heart. The fury drained from his face, replaced by something raw and desperate. He dropped Marcus like a stone and was moving toward her, his eyes never leaving her face as if she might disappear if he looked away. "You're awake," he breathed, his hands hovering over her as if he was afraid to touch her, afraid she might shatter. "I'm alive," she said gently, reaching up to cup his bloodied face. "I'm here." He pulled her against him then, crushing her to his chest with a force that would have broken bones if she'd been fully human. She could feel him shaking, could smell the salt of tears he was trying not to shed. "I thought I'd lost you," he whispered into her hair. "I thought they'd taken you from me." "Never," she murmured back. "It would take more than poison to keep me from you." Around them, the gathered nobles watched in silence, seeing their terrifying alpha king reduced to a man desperately grateful for the woman in his arms. "But we need to find who did this," she said, pulling back to look at his face. "The right way. With justice, not vengeance." His jaw clenched. "Lyra." "Trust me," she said firmly. "Let me help you. We're stronger together, remember." For a moment, she thought he might refuse. The wolf in him was still howling for blood, for retribution against anyone who had dared threaten his mate. Then his shoulders relaxed slightly, and he nodded. Together. It took 3 more days to uncover the truth, but when they did, it shattered everything they thought they knew. Lady Serena Blackwood sat in chains in the throne room, her perfect golden hair hanging in strings around her tear-stained face. But she wasn't the mastermind, just another pawn in a game that had been playing for decades. "It was never supposed to be her," Serena sobbed, looking at Lyra with desperate eyes. "It was supposed to be me. I was supposed to be queen." "Who?" Kieran's voice was deadly quiet. "Who told you that?" She said, "She promised that if the Omega died, you would choose me. That it was the natural order, the way things should be." "Who?" This time he roared it and Serena flinched. "Lady Vivian," she whispered. "Your aunt." She said the bloodline had to stay pure. The revelation hit like a thunderbolt. Kieran's aunt, his father's sister, the woman who had helped raise him after his parents died. She had been at court for decades, had access to everything, knew everyone's secrets. "She killed your father too," Serena continued, the words spilling out in a rush. "Made it look like an accident to force Lyra to return to court. She said it was the only way to get her close enough to finish what should have been done years ago." Lyra felt the room spin around her. All this time, the enemy had been right there, hiding behind family loyalty and noble blood. "Where is she?" Kieran's voice was barely human now. "Gone," Lord Aldrich said quietly from the doorway. "Fled in the night. We found her chambers empty, her belongings scattered. But we'll find her, your majesty, however long it takes." Kieran nodded once, sharp and final. "See that you do." 1 month later, under the light of the full moon, the entire kingdom gathered in the great courtyard for the Luna Queen's official coronation ceremony. Lyra stood beside Kieran on the marble platform, wearing a gown of pure white silk that seemed to glow in the moonlight. The Luna Queen's crown, remade with additional diamonds to mark her survival, caught the light like captured stars. But it wasn't the crown or the gown that took everyone's breath away. It was the way she stood, confident, strong, every inch the queen she had fought to become. The little Omega, who had once been mocked and dismissed, now commanded the respect and loyalty of an entire kingdom. "My people," Kieran's voice carried across the silent crowd, "I present to you your Luna Queen, protector of the innocent, defender of the weak, and the strongest woman I have ever known." The crowd erupted in cheers, genuine this time, not the polite applause of political necessity. They had seen her face death and emerge victorious. They had watched her calm their king's rage and bring justice instead of vengeance. She had earned their loyalty not through bloodlines or politics, but through her actions. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Lyra found herself thinking of a scared little girl who had once dared to speak before a king. That child could never have imagined this moment, standing under the same moon, beside the same man, but as his equal in every way that mattered. "Regrets?" Kieran asked softly, taking her hand as they watched their people celebrate below. She looked up at the moon, then at the man beside her, her king, her mate, her destiny. "None," she said, and meant it completely. In the crowd below, she spotted faces that had laughed at her all those years ago. Lord Aldrich, who now bowed when she passed. The guards who had once dismissed her as a worthless Omega child. Even some of the nobles who had whispered cruel words were now cheering her name. They had learned, as she had always known, that strength had nothing to do with bloodlines. And somewhere in the moonlight, carried on the wind like a whisper of prophecy fulfilled, the echo of a 7-year-old's bold promise seemed to dance through the air. The little Omega's words, once laughed at, became the prophecy that crowned a queen. If you enjoyed this werewolf romance audiobook, don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more romance audiobooks like this one. See you in the next one.